There are many different ways to build and host web applications on your own servers. The skills required to develop these applications are varied, but in general, a good knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is required. The external application development template relies heavily on the jQuery library to simplify the client-side scripting of HTML. The template set consists of 2 files plus the jQuery library and is intended as a starting point for developing your own external applications that access FirstClass user information data and allow you to store and retrieve application-specific data for users who are running the application. In this video, we'll walk through the sample application, and in the next video, we'll start with this set to create a new simple application. I'm going to open these files in my code editor of choice, Sublime Text, and let's first look at the index.html file. In the header, we first check to see if the jQuery library is available from the Google CDN, and if not, it loads the local copy stored in the same folder as the index file. Next, we load the app.js file that contains all of our JavaScript code. In the body of the index file, we see 2 divs, stored data and updated data, that currently contain no content. The HTML of these divs will be populated by the JavaScript code that we can look at now. Once the DOM has been loaded and we are within the document-ready jQuery function, we first define 2 global variables. The cross-post variable is an empty object that will store any data associated with the application, our 10,000 fields. If you are going to utilize user information data, then we need to determine what the server address is, and we have a function that does this and stores it in the server address variable. The remaining variables are where we define our configuration field variable, any storage fields, and define an object that will contain all of the user information data that we will retrieve from the session. When you are developing your own applications, you need to work with this section to determine which of these variables are required for your application. In the next video, we'll work through such a process. The app key variable is an object that specifies the ID of the configuration field, always 3000, and an empty string as the initial value. Upon launch, this value will be populated by the value you entered into the configuration field on your installation form. Our sample template, if you recall, retrieved and stored strings in 2 fields on our form numbered 10,000 and 10,001. For every storage field, you define an object like this. The ID contains the value of the field ID, and the data property contains the default value that you want to assign to this field. Remember, when you first launch the application, no data is stored, so the first thing that we will see is that default values are punched into those fields. Next, we set up the default empty values for the user object, and these will get populated as soon as the application launches. Finally, a launch type variable is declared to store whether or not this is the first time or if it's a subsequent launch of the application. The only area you need to modify is the storage field section. You can have up to 1,000 storage fields, and the value of ID must be in the range of 10,000 to 10,999. Now let's follow through the code to see what happens on launch. An event listener is created, listening for any data storage changes from the iframe code. This is triggered initially on launch so we can jump down to the data storage and update function area of our code. The comments here specify what we need to worry about. First, let's look at the receive cross-post message function. This function is triggered when the application launches or when a field is updated or a request for retrieval is made. On launch, the command is init. The only part you need to concern yourself is this section. If you are using a configuration field, you include that here by setting the field ID as a parameter of the getData function. Similarly, you try to retrieve the value stored in our 2 storage fields that are defined in the storage field object ID parameters. The app ID field points to the field on our form, and we do have the information there. the getData function tries to retrieve the data and packages up the information in an object and passes it back to the receiveCrossPostMessage function with the get command. This time it's not a init, so it passes the information on to the processData function. It does this asynchronously for each of the three fields that we are trying to retrieve data for. During the getData stage, if the data it is trying to receive is our configuration data, we check to see if there is anything on the form and assigns the data to the data attribute of our appKey object variable. If there is nothing there, there is an error and you are notified, as the application will likely be broken. If we are retrieving data from our storage fields, it retrieves it, if available, and stores it in the data attribute of the corresponding object. If the field doesn't exist, as it would on the very first launch, an error is passed by getData, so we use the setData function to pass our data values, which is stored in the storage field's data property as defined in our initialization of the variables. Once our final field has been retrieved, we can specify the launch type. If there was data in our storage fields, then our launch type is continue. But if we had to initialize our fields, then the launch type must have been an initial launch. We're now ready to start our application. Before we do that, let's take a look at the setData function, as we'll be using that in our code. We will never have to use the getData function again, as we will be keeping all of our stored data in our variables. It is only when we update those variables that we want to store it back to the form using the setData function. Like getData, the setData function packages up the field ID and the new data into an object with the set command and triggers a new window event that calls the receiveCrossPostMessage function. Since the command is set, it sends that off to the processData function with the set command. If there are no errors, we can be assured that the data has been stored successfully. Now let's get back to what happens after all of our storage variables are initialized. The startApp function is called. Before we actually start our application, we need to retrieve our user information. So we first define a function that will get the URL of our server. Once we have that, we use the API to retrieve that information and store it in our user object. Since JavaScript works asynchronously, we have to make sure that each of these functions are completed before we call the next one. So we use the jQuery deferred methodology to wait until the process has been completed. You don't really have to know how this function works, just be assured that it does. Once it has been retrieved, we get our user session information by making a call to the API. Again, this is a deferred action that will continue on to the appReady function when it has been completed. As with the getParentURL function, you don't really need to know how the API is called, but what it does is retrieve and store each of the values into our user object. Now that the information has all been retrieved and stored, we can finally run our application, where we start to build a string to insert as HTML into our stored data div. If the launch type is initial launch, we begin with an H3 heading that announces that. If it's a subsequent launch, we change the heading. Next, we just list the information that is stored in our variables. The one thing to note now, though, is that we must process the group data, as the data is either stored as a string if there is only one exposed group, or as an object if the user belongs to more than one exposed group. It's important to note that not all user groups that a user belongs to are exposed to the application. Only groups that the administrator has assigned a value to the group external tag field on the admit tab of the group form. The name used here is the one that is exposed, but it need not be the same as the name of the group. Once the data has been compiled, the stored div's HTML is inserted, and you are prompted to enter new values for each of the two storage fields. If you have not clicked Cancel, the data attributes of each of your storage object variables are updated, and the setData function is called to store the data back to the storage fields specified in the storage field ID. Finally, a new string is created containing these new storage values and inserted into the HTML attribute of the updated data div on the page. That completes the walkthrough of this template. In the next video, we'll use the template to create a new application.